She cooked for his elderly father. The silent CEO didn't expect to fall in love too. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the dining room inside the Harrison estate looked as though it had been prepared for a celebration. A polished walnut table stretched across the room. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier above. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, homemade bread, soup that was still steaming. Enough food for 6 people. Only one chair was occupied. Arthur Harrison, 79 years old, adjusted his glasses and quietly unfolded his napkin. He looked toward the chair across from him, empty, just like it had been yesterday, and the day before that, and for far too many evenings to remember. He smiled to himself with the kind of grace loneliness teaches people. Well, he murmured, at least someone keeps setting the table for hope. Just as he reached for his spoon, the doorbell rang. Arthur looked toward the hallway, surprised. His housekeeper had already gone home. He stood carefully and walked to the front door. Standing outside was a young woman holding a thermal food carrier almost as large as herself. She looked nervous. Rain had dampened a few loose strands of chestnut hair that had escaped her ponytail. When she smiled, it felt genuine enough to brighten the gloomy evening. Arthur opened the door. "You must be the new chef." The young woman blinked. "Oh no," she laughed awkwardly. "I'm not important enough to be called a chef. I'm just here to cook dinner for you." Arthur looked at the warm containers in her hands, then back into her kind eyes. He smiled. "It's been a very long time since someone cooked for me with love instead of a salary." The young woman lowered her eyes, unexpectedly moved. "My name is Claire Foster. I'm Arthur." "I know." She smiled. "I've heard you're my most difficult customer." Arthur pretended to look offended. "I prefer historically selective." Claire laughed. The empty dining room somehow felt a little less empty. Claire Foster was 25 years old. During the day, she worked in a small family-owned diner on the edge of Seattle. At night, she often prepared healthy meals for elderly clients recommended by local physicians. Not because it paid well, it didn't, but because Claire had lost her grandmother 2 years earlier. Ever since then, she found herself unable to ignore elderly people living alone. Her co-workers teased her constantly. "You adopted half the city's grandparents." Claire always answered the same way. "They're easier than dating." She wasn't entirely joking. She was warm, funny without trying, hopelessly clumsy, and completely incapable of cooking without humming softly to herself. Arthur noticed it almost immediately. "You sing while chopping carrots?" Claire looked embarrassed. "I forget I'm doing it. It reminds me of my wife." She paused. "I'm sorry." He smiled gently. "Don't be. Memories deserve music." Upstairs, hundreds of feet above downtown Seattle, Ethan Harrison stood inside a glass conference room overlooking the city skyline. 35 years old, founder and CEO of Harrison Technologies, one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the state. His calendar was scheduled in 15-minute blocks. His assistant once joked that breathing should probably be added as a recurring appointment. He wasn't entirely wrong. Since losing his mother 4 years earlier, Ethan had done what he understood best. He worked, longer, harder, more efficiently. He convinced himself that success was another language for love. His father never had to worry about money, medical bills, house repairs, private nurses. Everything was taken care of. Surely, that meant he was taking care of his father. His phone vibrated. "Dad." He declined the call automatically. A text appeared seconds later. "Busy?" He replied. "Meeting." Arthur answered with only one word. "Always." Ethan stared at the message for a moment, then turned back to the presentation. Meanwhile, inside the Harrison kitchen, Claire had somehow created complete chaos in less than 20 minutes. She opened one cabinet. 3 bowls fell out. She caught 2. The third bounced harmlessly across the floor. Arthur peeked around the corner. "I've seen military operations with less excitement." Claire laughed nervously. "I promise I'm usually better than this." "You've already broken anything?" "No." Arthur smiled. "Excellent." At that exact moment, Claire reached for the seasoning. Her elbow bumped an entire glass container of salt. It tipped, then emptied itself spectacularly across the cutting board. The vegetables disappeared beneath what looked like a small snowstorm. Claire froze. "Oh." Arthur stared for 2 seconds, then said very seriously, "Were you planning to preserve me for the winter?" Claire covered her face. "I am so sorry. I've never done that before." Arthur burst into laughter. "I certainly hope not. I'd be impossible to chew." Claire laughed too. Together, they spent several minutes rescuing perfectly innocent carrots from an unnecessary avalanche of salt. Dinner finally reached the table. Simple, healthy, and homemade. Arthur tasted the soup, closed his eyes, then quietly set down the spoon. Claire immediately panicked. Is something wrong? No. He smiled. Everything is. Claire frowned. I don't understand. My wife used to put just a little too much thyme in her soup. Claire's face fell. I'm sorry. Arthur shook his head. So do you. She looked confused. I do? Yes. He took another spoonful. And somehow, it tastes exactly like someone cared enough not to hurry. Claire felt her throat tighten. No one had ever complimented her cooking quite like that. Not by talking about the food, but by talking about the feeling it carried. 2 evenings later, Arthur decided enough was enough. His son hadn't joined them once. Every night, another excuse. Conference, investors, flight delays, emergency meetings. Arthur had spent 40 years teaching university students. He knew avoidance when he saw it, so he did something slightly dishonest. He called Ethan. His voice sounded strained. My back. It suddenly locked. Silence. Then Ethan's chair scraped loudly across the office floor. I'm coming. No, no. It'll pass. I'm already leaving. Arthur smiled after ending the call. Forgive me, he whispered toward a framed photo of his late wife. Our son was always easier to trick than to convince. Claire walked into the living room carrying tea. You didn't really hurt your back. Arthur looked guilty for approximately half a second. My conscience hurts a little. She tried not to laugh. You know that's manipulation. I prefer historical strategy. You were a professor. I know many strategies. 25 minutes later, headlights appeared outside. A sleek black sedan stopped in front of the house. Ethan Harrison stepped inside without removing his suit jacket. His face was filled with concern. Dad? Arthur slowly stood up from the sofa. Oh, you're here. Ethan frowned. You said you're back. It feels much better. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You tricked me. Arthur looked toward the kitchen. I invited you. They're different things. Not when you're my son. Ethan sighed, then finally noticed someone standing quietly near the dining table. Claire. She wore a light blue apron dusted with flour. A wooden spoon rested in one hand. A small streak of flour decorated her cheek without her realizing it. She was laughing, not at him, at something Arthur had just whispered. The sound echoed naturally through the house. Warm, effortless, alive. Ethan slowly turned toward his father. Arthur hadn't laughed like that in years, not since his wife passed away. And suddenly, the successful CEO realized something that no business report had ever shown him. A complete stranger had managed to give his father something that all his money never could, someone to share dinner with. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that realization hurt far more than any accusation ever could. Claire continued cooking at the Harrison estate every evening. At first, Ethan treated her presence the way he treated most disruptions, politely, briefly, and from a distance. He would enter through the front door after 9, ask his father if he had eaten, nod when Arthur said yes, then disappear into his study with a phone already pressed to his ear. Claire noticed the pattern by the 3rd night. Arthur noticed it long before that. The old professor began developing strategies. Some were subtle, most were not. One evening, just as Ethan reached for his coat after checking on his father, Arthur placed one hand against his lower back and sighed dramatically. Ethan stopped. Claire, rinsing plates in the kitchen, looked over her shoulder. Arthur saw her looking and winked. Ethan did not see the wink. Dad? Arthur gave a brave little smile. Nothing. Just age, reminding me it has a membership card. Ethan set his briefcase down. Arthur's eyes flicked toward the dining room. Claire immediately understood. 5 minutes later, Ethan was seated at the table with a bowl of vegetable stew in front of him, looking like a man who had been ambushed by dinner. Arthur ate happily. Claire pretended to be very interested in folding napkins. The next night, Arthur escalated. Ethan arrived late again, kissed the top of his father's head, and tried to leave after exactly 7 minutes. The front door would not open. Ethan tried the handle once. Then again, Arthur looked up from his chair with remarkable innocence. How strange. I think the lock is broken. Claire stood near the stove and immediately turned away so Ethan would not see her smile. Ethan looked at the door, then at his father, then at Claire's shoulders, which were trembling with suppressed laughter. The lock is not broken. Arthur blinked slowly. At my age, One never knows. Ethan reached above the frame, found the small brass latch Arthur had quietly turned, and unlocked it. Claire coughed into a dish towel. Arthur sighed. History will remember me as misunderstood. Ethan should have been annoyed. Instead, for one brief second, he almost smiled. That was happening more often around Claire. Almost smiles. Quiet glances he looked away from too quickly. She never tried to pull him into conversation. She didn't ask why he worked so much, or why his father seemed loneliest whenever Ethan was standing right in front of him. She simply cooked, hummed under her breath, dropped spoons at least twice a week, and somehow made the house feel less like a museum. Then one night, Claire found something she could not ignore. Ethan's car was parked outside with the driver's door half open. He had rushed in after a call from Arthur, leaving his briefcase and an empty coffee cup on the passenger seat. Only coffee. No lunch wrapper. No water bottle. No evidence that the man had eaten anything substantial all day. The next evening, she packed a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a small container of soup. She carried them outside while Ethan was upstairs with Arthur and placed the bag carefully on the driver's seat. No note, no name, just food. The next morning, the empty container appeared washed and stacked on the kitchen counter. Claire said nothing. Ethan said nothing. So she did it again and again. Sometimes a sandwich, sometimes pasta. Once, a blueberry muffin that had collapsed in the middle but still tasted wonderful. Each time, the containers returned clean. Each time, Ethan looked at her a little longer than before. Neither mentioned it. But something began moving between them in the quiet. A strange, tender language, made of meals left in cars, and dishes returned without words. Arthur, of course, noticed everything. He said nothing, which, for him, was extremely suspicious. The first night Ethan sat down without being tricked, Claire was making apple pie. The crust had one uneven edge, and the filling had bubbled over in the oven, leaving a sticky trail of cinnamon sugar on the tray. But the smell filled the entire downstairs. Warm apples, butter, nutmeg, a little too much cinnamon. Ethan stopped in the hallway. For a moment, he was no longer 35, exhausted, successful, and constantly late. He was 10 years old again, standing in the kitchen while his mother rolled pie dough on the counter. She used to press scraps of crust into little shapes for him, then tell him broken pieces tasted better because they had survived more. Claire turned and found him standing completely still. She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious. "I know it's not perfect." Ethan looked at the pie, then at her. "My mother used to make apple pie." Claire's expression softened. Arthur, seated near the window, lowered his book and said nothing. Claire carefully cut a slice while it was still too hot. The filling spilled slightly onto the plate. She looked mortified. Ethan took the plate anyway. He sat down. Not because Arthur sighed, not because the door was locked. He sat down because the smell had found a memory he had buried under work. The first bite was too warm, too sweet. The crust was uneven. It was not his mother's pie, but somehow that made it easier. It did not pretend to replace anything. It simply made room for what had been lost. Ethan finished the whole slice. Claire pretended not to notice. Arthur pretended not to cry. From that night on, Ethan came home a little earlier. Not perfectly, but enough for the house to notice. Enough for Arthur to stop checking the driveway every 10 minutes. Enough for Claire to start setting one extra plate without asking. Then everything changed on a Wednesday. Claire arrived to find the front door open and Arthur sitting in his chair, pale and sweating, one hand pressed against his chest. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Ethan arrived 12 minutes later, still in his suit, face drained of all color. At the hospital, Arthur insisted he was fine. He was not fine, not terribly ill, the doctor explained, but dangerously exhausted. His heart condition was manageable, but stress and loneliness were making everything worse. Ethan stood beside the hospital bed, silent. Claire waited near the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but unable to leave. The doctor looked at Ethan with practiced gentleness. "Mr. Harrison, your father has excellent care. Medication, diet support, monitoring. Financially, he has everything many patients don't." Ethan nodded once. The doctor paused. "But what he's missing most isn't medicine." Ethan looked up. "It's time with his son." The words landed harder than any diagnosis. Arthur closed his eyes. Claire looked down at her hands. Ethan did not move. For years, he had told himself he was providing. The house, the doctors, every practical thing money could buy. But no one had ever said the truth so plainly. His father was not starving for food. He was starving for Ethan. That night, Ethan sat beside Arthur's hospital bed long after visiting hours ended. For once, his phone remained face down. For once, the company waited. Across the room, Claire quietly placed a paper cup of tea beside him before leaving. Ethan looked at it, then at his father's sleeping face, and for the first time in years, the silent CEO had no strategy, no answer, and no meeting important enough to run to. Only the unbearable understanding that love he kept postponing might not wait forever. After Arthur's hospital visit, Ethan started coming home earlier. Not every night at first. His company still called. Meetings still stretched too long. Emergencies still appeared with dramatic timing, as if the business world personally objected to him having dinner with his father. But 3 nights a week became 4, 4 became 5, and slowly, the Harrison estate began expecting him before the food went cold. Claire noticed the change in small ways. Ethan's coat appeared on the hallway rack before 8. His coffee cups became fewer. His phone stayed in his pocket longer. And sometimes, when Arthur told a story from his university days, Ethan did not simply nod while reading messages. He listened. Arthur noticed too, though he pretended not to. He simply began asking for more complicated meals. According to him, recovery required culinary adventure. According to Claire, recovery required fewer fried things. According to Ethan, both of them were conspiring against him. One Friday evening, Claire placed an onion, a cutting board, and a knife in front of Ethan. He looked at them with the caution of a man facing a hostile takeover. "You want me to cook? I want you to chop. That feels like the dangerous part. It's an onion. It has layers. So do corporate lawsuits." Claire handed him the knife handle first. "You'll survive." Arthur sat at the table with a notebook and pen, looking far too pleased. Ethan frowned. "What is that?" "Scorecard," Arthur said. Claire tried not to laugh. Ethan began cutting the onion. His first slices were uneven. His second attempt was better. By the third, his eyes had started watering. Claire leaned closer, studying his face. "Are you remembering your mother?" Ethan blinked hard. "Or your fingers?" Arthur burst out laughing. Ethan looked down at the knife, then at the onion. At this point, both are at risk. Claire took his hand gently and adjusted his grip. The contact was brief, practical, completely innocent. Still, Ethan went still. Claire felt it too. She released his hand quickly and reached for the carrots. Arthur looked between them with the satisfied expression of an old man watching history repeat itself in a kitchen. At dinner, Arthur sampled Ethan's vegetable stew with great seriousness. He chewed, paused, looked at the ceiling as if consulting ancient wisdom. 4 out of 10. Ethan stared at him. 4, a generous 4. Claire tasted her own spoonful and smiled. "I'd say 6. Arthur pointed his spoon at her. "You get 11. "That's not how 10-point scales work," Ethan said. "I'm retired. I make my own scales." Ethan should have been offended. Instead, he laughed. A real laugh. Quiet, surprised, and so unfamiliar in that dining room that Claire looked up immediately. For a second, she saw the man beneath the title. Not the CEO, not the son carrying guilt like a second suit jacket. Just Ethan. Tired, handsome, awkward with onions, and finally present. The thought warmed her in a way she knew she should be careful with. The power went out 2 weeks later during a storm. Arthur declared it romantic weather, which made Ethan choke on his water and Claire nearly drop a candle. They ate dinner by candlelight in the dining room, the rain tapping against the tall windows. The meal was simple: soup, bread, roasted vegetables, and slices of apple pie left over from the day before. With the chandelier dark, the room felt less formal, smaller, almost ordinary. Arthur told stories by candlelight, about Ethan as a boy, about his late wife burning toast and blaming academic distraction, about the year Ethan tried to build a birdhouse and accidentally created what Arthur described as a wooden legal liability. Ethan protested each story. Claire loved every one. After dinner, Arthur grew tired and went upstairs early. Claire cleaned the kitchen by candlelight, humming softly as usual. When she stepped outside into the garden for air, Ethan followed a few minutes later. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass shining silver beneath the moon. The old porch swing creaked softly as Claire sat down. Ethan remained standing for a moment, then sat beside her, leaving careful space between them. Neither spoke at first. The quiet did not feel empty. Claire wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "Your father looks better." "He does. He likes having you home." Ethan looked toward the dark windows of the house. "I thought giving him everything meant I was being a good son. You gave him safety." "I forgot companionship." Claire did not correct him. The honesty was enough. After a while, Ethan said, "My mother used to sit out here." Claire turned toward him. "When she was sick, she didn't want the house to feel like a hospital, so she came here with blankets, tea, and stubbornness." His voice softened. "I used to be afraid if I sat with her too long, I'd see how little time was left." Claire's chest tightened, "So I worked. I told myself I was building something she'd be proud of." Maybe she was proud. Ethan looked at her, and maybe she still wanted her son beside her. The words trembled at the edge of regret. Claire looked down at her hands. "When my grandmother got sick, I stayed too much." He frowned gently. "Too much. I stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, stopped thinking about anything except meals, medicine, appointments. After she passed, I didn't know who I was without someone to take care of." Ethan listened without interruption. Claire gave a small smile. "That's why I cook for people like your father. I think part of me is still trying to make one more dinner she can eat." The porch swing moved slowly beneath them. For the first time, Ethan understood that Claire's warmth was not effortless. It had been earned through loss. He turned toward her. "You make this house feel alive." Claire's breath caught. "Ethan, I don't say things well. You say quarterly earnings very well." A small smile touched his mouth. "That's easier. Less risky. Much less." She looked at him then, and something quiet passed between them. When Claire stood to go back inside, Ethan rose too. She reached the back door before he said her name. "Claire." She turned. He stepped closer, slowly enough that she could have moved away. She didn't. Instead of kissing her mouth, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to her forehead. It was brief, warm, reverent. A kiss that asked for nothing and somehow said too much. Then Ethan pulled back, immediately flustered. "I'm sorry." Claire looked at him, her cheeks warm, her eyes bright. Next time, his expression changed. She smiled softly. "Maybe don't apologize." For one breathless second, the garden seemed to hold still around them. Then Claire went inside. Ethan remained beneath the porch light, one hand touching the back of his neck, looking like a man who had just stepped into a room in his heart he did not know still existed. 3 days later, Claire received the call from Boston. The restaurant was small but respected. The owner had tasted her food through a mutual contact. They wanted her as head chef, triple her current pay, health insurance, her own kitchen, a chance she had never imagined at 25. Claire sat on the edge of her bed that night, staring at the offer letter on her laptop. She should have been thrilled. Part of her was, another part heard Arthur laughing in the dining room, saw Ethan standing in the garden after the first kiss he had been too afraid to claim, felt the warmth of a house that had slowly begun to feel dangerous, not because it was cold, because it was beginning to feel like home. She did not tell Ethan. Not yet. She folded the offer letter, placed it in her bag, and went to work the next evening, with a smile careful enough to fool almost everyone. Almost. Arthur watched her from across the dining table and said nothing, which for Arthur Harrison meant he already knew something was about to change. Arthur knew about Boston before Ethan did. Of course he did. Claire had tried to hide the offer letter, but Arthur Harrison had spent 40 years reading the faces of students who claimed they had finished assignments they had absolutely not finished. A young woman trying to hide a life-changing decision had no chance against him. He did not tell Ethan, not because he wanted to be cruel, because he wanted his son to notice. For once, Arthur wanted Ethan to recognize the sound of someone leaving before the door closed. So when Claire arrived that Friday evening with grocery bags heavier than usual and a smile too careful to be natural, Arthur simply watched. She cooked all of Ethan's favorites: apple pie with uneven crust, roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, the vegetable stew he had failed at 3 times, fresh bread, even the little butter cookies Ethan's mother used to make, though Claire had never quite mastered their shape. Arthur sat near the kitchen window, pretending to read. Claire hummed less than usual. That told him everything. "Last dinner?" he asked softly. Claire's hands paused over the cutting board. She did not turn around. "My flight is tomorrow morning." Arthur closed his book. "Does he know?" Her silence answered. Arthur sighed. Claire, if I tell him, he'll feel obligated to say something. Perhaps he should. She smiled sadly. Or perhaps this is the kindest way. Arthur looked toward the doorway where Ethan still had not appeared. No, my dear, kindness is not always the same as silence. But Claire said nothing more. She only returned to the stove, stirring the soup with eyes that shone too brightly in the kitchen light. Ethan found out by accident. At 8:12 p.m., while standing in an executive elevator downtown, he opened a message from Arthur. It contained a single photo. The dining table, candles lit, 3 plates set, Claire's apple pie cooling at the center. Underneath, Arthur had typed, "Your last chance is getting cold." Ethan frowned. Then another message arrived. Boston, tomorrow. The elevator doors opened. Ethan did not step out. His assistant, waiting with a folder, froze. Mr. Harrison? Ethan looked at the photo again. Something cold moved through his chest. How long is the investor call? 40 minutes. Cancel it. Her eyes widened. With respect, we can't, we can. He was already moving. For once, the company did not get the last word. By the time Ethan reached the estate, rain had begun falling softly over the driveway. He entered through the front door without his usual composure. The dining room was quiet. The candles had burned low. Arthur's plate sat empty. Claire's was gone. Ethan stopped. He was too late. From the kitchen came the soft sound of running water. He walked in slowly. Claire stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, washing the last of the dinner plates. Her hair was tied back. Her apron was damp near the waist. The room smelled like lemon, thyme, butter, and goodbye. She did not turn at first. "I saved you pie," she said quietly. Ethan stood beside the island. "How long were you going to let me not know?" Her hands stilled in the water. Then she continued washing. "Until tomorrow morning. That feels unfair. So does asking me to stay when you haven't asked yourself what you want." He had no answer, because she was right. Claire handed him a towel without looking at him. He took it. For several minutes, they washed dishes together in silence. She rinsed. He dried. Their shoulders almost touched. Neither moved away. The silence held everything they were not brave enough to say. "Thank you. Don't go. I'm afraid. I want you. I don't know how to ask." When the last plate was dried, Claire reached for the towel. Ethan did not let go immediately. Their fingers touched. She looked up. His face was no longer unreadable. It was open in a way that made her chest ache. "I didn't know how much this house had changed," he said, "until I imagined it without you in it." Claire blinked back tears. "Ethan," Arthur's voice came faintly from the hallway, "I am going to bed now, because unlike some people, I know when to leave a room." Claire laughed through a tear. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "My father is impossible. He's usually right. Unfortunately." They listened as Arthur slowly made his way upstairs, humming loudly enough to make his exit impossible to miss. Later, Ethan walked Claire to the front gate. The rain was light now, more mist than storm. Garden lights glowed along the path. At the gate, Claire stopped. Ethan stopped with her. Neither wanted to open it. For once, Ethan did not hide behind restraint. He reached for her hand. Claire looked down at their joined fingers, then back at him. His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. No apology this time, no hesitation. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to step away. She didn't. Their kiss was soft at first, careful, then deeper, warmer, filled with all the words that had been gathering between them for weeks. It tasted faintly of rain and apple pie, and the kind of longing neither of them had expected to find in a house built around absence. When they finally pulled apart, Claire rested her forehead against his chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around her. Not to keep her, just to hold her while he still could. She did not leave immediately. They sat on the front porch long after the rain stopped, wrapped in the quiet between midnight and morning. They talked about Boston, about fear, about Ethan's mother, about Claire's grandmother, about how easy it was to mistake responsibility for love, and how hard it was to admit you wanted someone beside you. At some point, Claire's head rested against his shoulder. Ethan held her close. There were no promises, no desperate speeches, no declarations that would turn her dream into a burden, only the stillness of two people understanding that something between them had changed. They no longer wanted to walk forward alone, but wanting was not the same as asking someone to stay. The next morning, Ethan drove Claire to the airport. Arthur had insisted on coming too, then claimed he was too emotionally dignified for terminals, and hugged Claire in the driveway instead. At the drop-off lane, travelers hurried past with luggage and coffee cups. Claire stood beside Ethan's car, holding her small suitcase. Her eyes were already wet. Ethan placed both hands in his coat pockets, because if he touched her, he feared he would not be able to let go. "You could ask me," she whispered. He looked at her. "I know." "And you won't?" His jaw tightened. "If Boston is your dream," his voice almost broke, "I won't be the reason you don't chase it." Claire nodded, but tears spilled down her cheeks. "That's noble. It feels terrible." She laughed softly through the pain. "It is terrible." For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. Ethan held her tightly, closing his eyes. When she pulled back, he brushed one tear from her cheek. "Call when you land?" She smiled sadly. "You'll answer? Even if I'm in a meeting." "That sounds serious." "It is." The boarding reminder flashed on the terminal screen behind her. Claire took her suitcase. Then, before she lost courage, she walked inside. Ethan watched until the doors swallowed her from view. Only then did he let himself lean against the car. The airport noise moved around him. Planes took off. People arrived and left. And Ethan Harrison, who had spent years believing love meant providing everything, finally understood that sometimes love meant opening your hand, even when the person you loved was walking away. For 3 days after Claire left, the Harrison estate became quiet again. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The old kind. The kind that sat in corners. The kind that made the dining table look too long. Arthur still ate dinner downstairs, but he took longer with each bite. Ethan came home on time, exactly as he had promised himself he would, yet every room reminded him of what had changed and what he had allowed to leave. Claire's apron was gone from the hook near the pantry. No soft humming came from the kitchen. No sandwich appeared in his car. No one dropped spoons and apologized to the spoons afterward. On the 4th night, Ethan stood at the stove trying to reheat soup Claire had frozen for Arthur before leaving. He burned the bottom. Arthur tasted it anyway, then placed his spoon down with great seriousness. 3 out of 10. Ethan stared at the bowl. "That seems generous." "It is. Grief gets 1 sympathy point." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Arthur watched him for a long moment, then slowly reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out an old envelope. The paper had yellowed at the edges. Ethan saw his mother's handwriting before Arthur even spoke. His chest tightened. "What is that?" Arthur placed it on the table. "Something your mother wrote years ago." Ethan did not reach for it immediately. "Why didn't you give it to me before?" Arthur looked toward the kitchen. "Because I hoped you would not need it." The room went still. Finally, Ethan picked up the envelope and opened it carefully. The letter smelled faintly of old paper and lavender, the way his mother's desk drawer used to smell. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. "My dear Ethan, if your father has given you this letter, it means he has probably tried subtlety and failed. Do not blame him. He was never very good at subtlety, although he remains convinced otherwise." A broken laugh escaped Ethan. Arthur looked offended. "She was wrong about many things." Ethan kept reading. "You have always believed love should be useful. You fixed broken things before anyone asked. You worked harder when you were frightened. You tried to protect people by becoming impossible to need." His vision blurred. "But one day, my son, you may meet someone who does not need your money, your house, or your perfect answers. Someone who brings laughter back into the rooms you forgot were empty. Someone who makes the kitchen feel alive again." Ethan stopped breathing. Claire, her flour-dusted cheek, her hands around a warm mug, her laughter echoing under candlelight. If that day comes, do not let her walk away simply because you were too busy to understand what was standing in front of you. The letter shook in his hands. Let work wait. Let pride wait. Let fear wait. But do not let love wait forever. Ethan pressed the page to his mouth as tears finally fell. For years he had missed his mother in silence. Now her words had found the exact place he was most broken. Arthur's voice softened across the table. "I'm old." Ethan looked up through tears. Arthur smiled gently. "But I'm not so old that I don't know when my son is in love." Ethan wiped his face with one hand. "She has a life in Boston." "Yes. A dream." "Yes. I can't ask her to give that up." Arthur leaned back. "Then don't." Ethan frowned. Arthur pointed toward the kitchen. "Go there with something better than a request." "What?" "A meal." Ethan looked at the burned soup on the stove. Arthur added, "Preferably not that one." For the first time in days, Ethan laughed. It cracked through the grief like light through a window. Then he stood. He did not call Claire or text her. He did not ask if she wanted him to come. Some things were too important to send through a screen. He went into the kitchen, opened the notebook where Claire had written simple recipes for him, and chose the easiest one. Chicken stew. 4 ingredients he understood. 3 he did not. He cooked slowly, terribly. Honestly, he burned one edge of the vegetables, added too much salt, forgot the parsley, packed the result into a small food container anyway. At dawn, he drove to Boston. Claire's first week at the Boston restaurant was everything she had hoped for, and everything she feared. The kitchen was fast, bright, demanding, and alive with noise. She had her own station, her own knives, her own team looking to her for decisions. She should have felt only proud. And she did. Mostly. But every time she tasted soup, she thought of Arthur. Every time someone complimented her pie, she remembered Ethan eating in silence like the first bite had hurt him. Every night after closing, she nearly called, then stopped. She had chosen this. He had let her. Maybe that was love. Maybe that was goodbye. On Friday night, Claire finished her shift just after 11. Her hair was tied messily beneath a cap. Her chef's coat smelled of butter, herbs, and exhaustion. She stepped out the back door into the cool Boston air and froze. Ethan stood beneath the alley light. No suit, no driver, no flowers. Just a dark coat, tired eyes, and a small food container held carefully in both hands. Claire stared at him. "Ethan?" He smiled nervously. For the first time, he lifted the container. "I cooked by myself." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. He stepped closer, but not too close. "I didn't come to ask you to leave Boston." Her eyes filled instantly. "I didn't come to make your dream smaller." He looked down at the container. "I came because you spent weeks cooking for my father. For me. For a house that had forgotten how to be warm." His voice softened. "And I wanted, just once, to be the person who brought food to you." Claire took the container with trembling hands. The lid opened with a small click. The stew inside was not beautiful. The carrots were uneven. One corner looked slightly burned. The color was questionable. She could see too much salt clinging to the potatoes. Ethan looked mortified. "I know it's not good." Claire picked up the spoon. "Don't say that. I tasted it in Connecticut. It was aggressive." A laugh broke through her tears. She took one bite. It was too salty, a little smoky. The chicken was dry, the vegetables were soft in places and stubborn in others, and still, tears spilled down her cheeks. Ethan's face fell. "That bad?" Claire shook her head quickly. "It's good." He gave her a look. "You're lying." "No, Claire." She laughed and cried at the same time. "It's the best thing I've eaten all week." "That is impossible." "No, it isn't." She looked down at the messy, imperfect stew, then back at him. "It's the best because someone cooked for me." Ethan's eyes shone. For a moment, neither moved. The alley behind the restaurant was cold, ordinary, and badly lit. Not romantic by any reasonable standard, but Claire had never felt more loved. Ethan took one careful step closer. "I don't know how to do this perfectly," she smiled through tears. "You're not supposed to. I don't know how to love someone without trying to schedule it. Then don't schedule it. I don't know if Boston and Seattle can work. We don't have to know tonight." That answer seemed to loosen something in him. Claire held the container against her chest. "Are you staying?" Ethan looked at her. "If you'll let me take you to breakfast after you finish insulting my stew." She laughed softly. "I already insulted it silently. I deserve that." Claire stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Ethan held her like a man who had finally stopped arriving late. Above them, the restaurant lights hummed. Behind them, the city moved on. And in Claire's hands, the imperfect meal stayed warm. Not because it was well made, just because love had finally learned how to show up. 1 year later, the Harrison dining room looked almost the same. The long walnut table still reflected the chandelier light. The crystal glasses still stood in careful rows. The windows still looked out over the quiet garden, where rain often softened the evenings. But now, 3 chairs were pulled out, and none of them stayed empty. Arthur was healthier. Not young, as he reminded everyone frequently, but historically durable. His heart still required care. His medication still sat in a small box by the kitchen window, and Claire still watched his salt intake with the seriousness of a national security officer. Claire still worked as a chef. Boston had become part of her life, but not the whole of it. She traveled, cooked, learned, and came back often enough that the Harrison kitchen never forgot her laughter. Ethan was still CEO, still serious in meetings, still capable of making an entire room nervous by saying nothing. But every Friday evening, his calendar changed. No investor calls, no late presentations, no urgent dinners with people who confused importance with noise. Only home, only his father, only Claire, only dinner. That Friday, Ethan stood at the stove wearing an apron Claire had bought him in Boston. It said, "I read the recipe." Mostly. Arthur sat at the table with his old scorecard. Claire leaned against the counter, smiling as Ethan carefully served the stew. Arthur took one bite, paused dramatically. Ethan waited. Claire folded her arms. Arthur finally nodded. 6 out of 10. Ethan stared. Still 6? A strong 6. Claire laughed. That's progress. Arthur pointed his spoon at Ethan. He still has to learn for the rest of his life. Ethan looked at Claire. Something warm moved between them, quiet and familiar now. I'm glad I have a teacher. Claire's smile softened. Good, because you still cut onions like they personally betrayed you. Arthur laughed so hard he had to set down his spoon. Ethan tried to look offended. Failed. Outside the window, evening settled gently over the garden. Inside, the kitchen glowed with warm light, flour on the counter, music playing softly, and 3 people gathered around a table that had waited too long to feel full again. There was no proposal. Not yet, but soon. Only Ethan, reaching for Claire's hand beneath the table. Only Arthur pretending not to notice, and noticing everything. Only the sound of laughter rising through a house that had once mistaken silence for peace. And as the view drifted slowly back from the window, the old dining room held its simplest miracle. A meal still warm, a family still becoming, and one chair that would never have to wait alone again. Sometimes, love doesn't begin with grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes, it begins with something as simple as showing up for dinner. Ethan spent years believing that providing for the people he loved was enough, until one quiet woman reminded him that the greatest gift we can give isn't money or success, it's our presence. I believe the people who truly change our lives rarely ask us to become someone else. They simply help us become the person we were too busy, too afraid, or too broken to be. And perhaps that's why the warmest homes aren't built with expensive walls. They're built around tables where no one has to eat alone. So I'd love to ask you if you could share one more dinner with someone you've lost, or someone you love, who would be sitting across the table from you. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. Every week, we share heartfelt journeys about love and healing. Until our next story, take time for the people waiting for you, because sometimes the chair that stays empty the longest is the one that matters most.